It was a cold, rainy night when I received the call for an unexpected shift. Being a train conductor isn't usually this unpredictable, but the job had its quirks. I was told to report to an old, abandoned railway line that hadn't been used in years. The line ran through a remote area, mostly forgotten by time and progress. I'd heard stories about it, but they were just that, stories. I didn't think much of them as I prepared to head out, pulling on my uniform and grabbing my keys. The drive to the station was uneventful, the rain tapping lightly against my windshield. The roads were deserted, which wasn't unusual for this time of night. As I approached the old station, a sense of unease settled over me. The place was run down, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform, and a thick layer of grime covering the windows. The lights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the surrounding area. I parked my car and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. The station master, a man I'd never seen before, greeted me with a nod. He was an older gentleman, with deep lines etched into his face and a somber expression. He handed me a small lantern, explaining that the train was due to arrive soon. I glanced around, half expecting to see other crew members, but there was no one else in sight. The station was eerily silent, the only sound being the distant rumble of thunder. "Is it just me tonight?" I asked, trying to mask the nervousness in my voice. The station master gave me a strange look before nodding. "You're the only one needed for this run," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The train knows its way." Before I could ask him what he meant, the sound of a train whistle echoed through the night. I turned to see a train emerging from the darkness, its headlights cutting through the fog that had settled over the tracks. The train looked ancient, its metal exterior rusted and worn. It was an old steam locomotive, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs from decades ago. My heart skipped a beat as it pulled into the station, the wheels screeching against the rails. I climbed aboard, my footsteps echoing in the empty carriage. The interior was just as old as the exterior, with wooden seats and brass fixtures that had long lost their shine. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else I couldn't quite place, something that made my stomach churn. I made my way to the front of the train, where the conductor's cabin awaited. The controls were familiar, but everything felt off, like I was stepping back in time. As the train began to move, I settled into my seat, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. The rain was still falling outside, the drops tapping against the windows in a rhythmic pattern. I stared out into the night, watching the dark landscape pass by. There was nothing but trees and fog, the world outside the train seeming almost unreal. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd. The train wasn't on any schedule I recognized, and the route was unfamiliar. I tried to contact the station for clarification, but the radio crackled with static. I fiddled with the dials, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get a clear signal. The unease that had been lingering in the back of my mind began to grow, my instincts telling me something was very wrong. Then I heard the faint sound of voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized the voices were coming from the passenger carriages behind me. I hadn't seen anyone board the train, but now I could distinctly hear people talking, their words muffled and indistinct. I left the cabin, lantern in hand, and made my way down the aisle, peering into each carriage. The voices grew louder as I walked, a low murmur that seemed to echo through the train. I finally reached the last carriage and pushed open the door, the lantern's light casting long shadows across the floor. What I saw made my blood run cold. The carriage was full of passengers, men, women, and children, all dressed in clothing from a different era. They were seated quietly, their faces pale and expressionless. None of them acknowledged me as I stood there, frozen in place. Their eyes were vacant, staring straight ahead as if they were lost in some distant memory. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly the train jolted, and the lights flickered. The passengers seemed to come to life, their heads turning in unison to look at me. Their eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light from my lantern. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. The murmuring voices grew louder, a chorus of whispers that filled the air, suffocating me with their intensity. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty train. I reached the conductor's cabin and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the controls. The train was speeding up, the landscape outside becoming a blur. I tried to stop it, but the brakes wouldn't respond. The radio was still dead, the static a constant, grating noise in the background. The whispers followed me, seeping through the walls, filling my head with fragments of conversations, cries for help, and desperate pleas. It was like they were trying to drag me into their world, a world of endless night and sorrow. I could feel their presence around me, cold and oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. I don't know how long I fought against the terror that threatened to overwhelm me, but eventually I began to notice a pattern in the voices. They were reliving their final moments, over and over again, trapped in a cycle of death and despair. I remembered the stories I'd heard about the old railway line, how a train had derailed decades ago, killing everyone on board. The wreckage had never been recovered, and the spirits of the passengers were said to haunt the tracks, waiting for someone to help them find peace. Desperate, I tried to communicate with them, asking them what they wanted, how I could help them. The voices didn't respond directly, but I could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped even further, and the lantern flickered as if it was about to go out. I grabbed the old train log from the cabin and flipped through it, searching for any clue, any hint of what I needed to do. The log was filled with entries from years ago, detailing the daily operations of the train. Then, I found a single, scribbled note in the margins, written in a shaky hand: return to the station. Find the light. I didn't know what it meant, but I had no other choice. I focused all my energy on turning the train around, guiding it back to the station where I had started. The controls resisted at first, but then, as if guided by some unseen force, the train began to slow and change direction. The whispers grew more frantic, but I blocked them out, concentrating on the task at hand. The journey back felt like an eternity, the weight of the spirits pressing down on me, trying to pull me into their despair. But I held on, gripping the controls tightly, my knuckles white. The rain outside had turned into a downpour, the drops pounding against the windows with relentless force. Finally, the station came into view, its lights a beacon in the darkness. The train pulled in slowly, the wheels grinding against the tracks as if it was struggling against an unseen force. I brought it to a stop, my hands trembling with exhaustion. As the train settled, the voices began to fade, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped out of the cabin, my legs weak, and made my way back through the carriages. The passengers were still there, but something had changed. Their expressions were no longer blank. Instead, they looked peaceful, almost content. The air around them seemed lighter, the oppressive presence that had hung over them lifting. I made my way to the station platform, where the station master was waiting. He didn't say anything as I approached, just gave me a nod of approval. I handed him the train log, and he took it with a solemn expression. "The light," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of understanding. "You found it." I didn't know what he meant, but I nodded anyway, too exhausted to ask questions. The train sat silently behind me, the ancient locomotive now at rest. The spirits had found their peace, their final journey complete. I left the station that night, the rain still pouring down, washing away the fear and tension that had gripped me. I never returned to that old railway line, and I never spoke of what happened. Some things are best left in the past, buried with the ghosts that haunt them. But I'll never forget the faces of those passengers, the hollow eyes that stared into my soul, and the whispers that echoed in my mind long after I left that train behind. The ghost train, they called it, and now I knew why. Silverwood Crossing was a place that felt as though it had been forgotten by time. Tucked away in a remote corner of the countryside, the small town was surrounded by dense forests that stretched for miles, with a few narrow roads winding through the trees like veins on a leaf. The people who lived there were few in number, and they tended to keep to themselves, living quiet lives that seemed to belong to another era. It was the kind of place where stories were passed down through generations, where legends and folklore were woven into the fabric of daily life, and one of those legends was the story of the Phantom Train. I first heard about the Phantom Train from my grandfather when I was a child. He was a man of few words, a retired railway worker who had spent most of his life on the tracks, and he wasn't one for telling tall tales. But when he spoke of the Phantom Train, there was a seriousness in his voice that made me believe every word he said. He told me the story on a stormy night, much like the one when the train vanished, as we sat by the fire in the old family farmhouse. According to my grandfather, it happened in the fall of 1943, during the height of World War II. The train was a local passenger service, a small, sturdy locomotive that ran between Silverwood Crossing and a larger town about 50 miles away. It was a lifeline for the people of Silverwood, the only reliable connection to the outside world. The train made the journey twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, and it was always on time, no matter the weather. But on that fateful night, something went terribly wrong. A fierce storm had rolled in from the north, bringing with it heavy rain, howling winds, and flashes of lightning that lit up the sky like fireworks. The evening train had left Silverwood Crossing on schedule, its carriages packed with passengers workers returning home, families visiting relatives, and a few soldiers on leave, heading back to their posts. My grandfather was working at the station that night, and he remembered watching the train pull out of the station, its lights glowing dimly in the pouring rain. The storm grew worse as the night went on, the wind howling through the trees and the rain lashing against the windows of the station. My grandfather and the other station workers huddled inside, listening to the storm rage outside, waiting for the train to return. But as the hours passed, there was no sign of it. Midnight came and went, and still the train didn't appear. The workers began to worry, fearing that something had happened to it in the storm. The next morning, when the storm finally subsided, a search party was organized to find the missing train. The tracks were checked for miles in both directions, from Silverwood Crossing to the next town, but there was no trace of the train or its passengers. The tracks were clear, undamaged by the storm, and there were no signs of a derailment or any kind of accident. It was as if the train had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions and an uneasy sense of dread. The disappearance of the train quickly became the talk of the town. The local authorities conducted a thorough investigation, questioning anyone who might have seen or heard something that night, but no one could explain what had happened. The train had left the station on time, following its usual route, but somewhere between Silverwood Crossing and its destination, it had disappeared without a trace. The passengers were never found, and their families were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. As time went on, the story of the missing train faded into the background, becoming just another ghost story in a town already full of them. But then, strange things began to happen. People started to report seeing the train again, late at night, on certain stormy evenings when the wind howled through the trees and the rain fell in sheets. They would see its lights in the distance, hear the faint sound of its whistle, and sometimes, if they were close enough, they would catch a glimpse of the ghostly figures inside, staring out of the windows with blank, lifeless eyes. One of the first to see the Phantom Train was an old farmer who lived near the tracks. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, and he didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. But one night, as he was closing up his barn, he heard the unmistakable sound of a train whistle cutting through the storm. Curious, he stepped outside and looked towards the tracks. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. There in the distance was the train, its dim lights barely visible through the rain. It was moving slowly, almost as if it were struggling against the storm, but there was no sound of an engine, no clatter of wheels on the tracks. The farmer watched in stunned silence as the train passed by, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Inside, he could see the shadowy figures of the passengers, sitting in their seats, their faces pale and expressionless. As the train disappeared into the night, the farmer stood there for a long time, too shocked to move. He never spoke of what he saw again. But he wasn't the only one. Over the years, more and more people came forward with their own stories of seeing the phantom train. Some claimed they saw it from a distance, its lights flickering in the night. Others said they heard its whistle, a mournful sound that echoed through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. A few even claimed to have seen the train up close, watching as it glided silently along the tracks, its ghostly passengers staring out at them with hollow eyes. There were stories of bad luck and misfortune befalling those who saw the phantom train. People who had seen it were said to experience strange occurrences, unexplained accidents, sudden illnesses, or even disappearances. Some believed that the train was cursed, that it was a harbinger of doom, and that those who saw it were marked by the spirits of the lost passengers, doomed to share their fate. My grandfather never saw the train himself, but he knew people who did, and he believed their stories. He told me that the phantom train was a warning, a reminder of the lives lost on that stormy night in 1943. He said that the train was still searching for its destination, trapped in a never-ending journey, and that the spirits of the passengers were restless, unable to find peace. As I grew older, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story, something that hadn't been explained. I became fascinated by the legend of the phantom train, and I started to dig deeper, looking for any clues or evidence that might shed light on what really happened that night. I visited the old station where my grandfather had worked, now long abandoned and overgrown with weeds. The tracks were still there, rusty and covered in moss, leading off into the dense forest. I walked along the tracks, trying to imagine what it must have been like on that stormy night. The train chugging through the darkness, its passengers unaware of the fate that awaited them. I spoke to the descendants of those who had disappeared, many of whom still lived in Silverwood Crossing. They told me about the grief and heartache their families had endured, about the unanswered questions that had haunted them for generations. Some of them believed that their loved ones were still out there, trapped on the phantom train, unable to move on. Others were more skeptical, dismissing the stories as nothing more than folklore, a way for the town to cope with the tragedy. But the more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was something real behind the legend. The stories were too consistent, the details too vivid to be mere coincidence. I began to wonder if the phantom train was somehow caught between worlds, a ghostly echo of the past, replaying its final journey over and over again. One stormy night, much like the one when the train disappeared, I decided to see if the legend was true. I drove out to the old station, parking my car near the tracks, and I waited. The rain was coming down hard, the wind whipping through the trees, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, hoping for a glimpse of the phantom train. Hours passed, and I began to think that maybe it was just a story after all, that I had let my imagination get the better of me. But then, just as I was about to leave, I heard the faint sound of a whistle, barely audible over the howling wind. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and I strained my eyes, peering into the darkness. And then I saw it. The train appeared out of the storm, its lights dim and flickering, moving slowly along the tracks. It was just as my grandfather had described, a small, sturdy locomotive, its carriages packed with passengers. But there was something wrong, something unnatural about the way it moved. It seemed to glide over the tracks, silent and eerie, as if it were floating on air. I watched in stunned silence as the train passed by, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Inside, I could see the ghostly figures of the passengers, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes fixed on some distant point. They didn't seem to notice me, didn't seem to notice anything at all, as if they were trapped in their own world, disconnected from reality. As the train disappeared into the night, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had seen it the phantom train of Silverwood Crossing, the ghostly remnant of that fateful night. After a long day at work, I was exhausted. I boarded the last train of the night, eager to get home. The station was nearly empty, and the train's hum was the only sound that broke the silence. I found a seat near the window, hoping to close my eyes for a few minutes. The train doors slid shut, and we started moving. As the train sped along, the gentle rocking made me feel drowsy. My eyes grew heavy, and I leaned my head against the window. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, everything was different. The train was still moving, but something was wrong. Not a single person was in sight. I stood up and looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that made my skin crawl. Panic started to bubble up inside me. I walked down the aisle, peering into the other carriages, but they were all the same, empty and silent. My heart began to race as I returned to my seat and checked my watch. It was past midnight, later than I thought. I looked out the window, expecting to see the familiar cityscape, but all I saw was darkness. The train was moving faster than usual, the view outside a blur of shadows. I tried to open the window, but it wouldn't budge. I rushed to the doors and tried to pry them open, but they were locked tight. I pulled out my phone to call someone, but there was no signal. The screen just displayed a frustrating no-service message. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I was completely cut off. I was trapped on a speeding train, alone, with no way to contact anyone. As the train picked up speed, the sound of the wheels on the tracks became louder, almost deafening. My thoughts raced as I tried to figure out what was going on. That's when a memory surfaced, something I had read years ago about a train crash on this very line. A late-night train had derailed, killing everyone on board. The cause was never fully explained. Some people believed it was just an accident, but others spoke of something more sinister, a ghost train doomed to repeat its final journey. My heart pounded in my chest. Could it be that I was on that train? Was I reliving the final moments of that tragic night? Desperation set in. I needed to get off this train. But how? The doors wouldn't open, the windows were sealed shut, and there was no way to stop the train. I had to find a way out before it was too late. I ran towards the front of the train, hoping to reach the driver's cabin. Maybe I could stop the train from there. But when I reached the door to the cabin, it was locked too. I banged on it with all my strength, shouting for the driver to stop the train, but there was no response. I was starting to lose hope. I glanced around, looking for anything that could help me. My eyes landed on the emergency brake. I pulled it hard, but nothing happened. The train kept speeding forward, ignoring my attempts to stop it. It was as if the train had a mind of its own, and it was determined to reach its destination. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. The train was now moving so fast that I could barely stand. I knew that up ahead, the tracks curved sharply. That's where the crash had happened. If I didn't find a way out soon, I would meet the same fate as those passengers from years ago. I searched the carriage again, my mind racing. Then I spotted an emergency hatch in the ceiling. It was my only chance. I grabbed a seat cushion and used it to smash the hatch open. The metal groaned as it gave way, and I climbed up, pulling myself through the narrow opening. The wind hit me like a wall as I emerged on top of the speeding train. The night air was cold, biting at my skin. I held on tight, the train's speed making it difficult to keep my balance. The city lights were a blur below, and the tunnel ahead loomed closer. I knew I had to jump, but the thought terrified me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The train was approaching the curve, and I knew I only had seconds to act. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to crouch low, ready to leap. The train began to tilt as it reached the curve, and in that split second I jumped. Time seemed to slow down as I flew through the air. I braced myself for the impact, and when I hit the ground, pain shot through my entire body. I tumbled across the gravel beside the tracks, the world spinning around me. But I was alive. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. My body ached all over, but I had made it. The train continued speeding ahead, and then, with a deafening crash, it derailed. The ground shook as the train left the tracks, the sound of twisting metal filling the air. I covered my head as debris rained down around me. The smell of burning metal and smoke was overwhelming. I stayed low, waiting for the chaos to subside. When it finally did, I looked up. The train was a mangled wreck, its carriages twisted and broken. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had narrowly escaped a disaster that seemed destined to happen. The train lay in ruins, its final journey ending in destruction. I slowly got to my feet, my legs shaking. I stared at the wreckage, still in shock. How had I survived? I had been on that train, living through the same moments that had claimed so many lives before. But somehow I had broken free from the loop. As I limped away from the scene, I heard the distant wail of sirens. Help was on the way, but I didn't need it anymore. I had already saved myself. The ride home was supposed to be a simple journey, but it had turned into something out of a nightmare. The memory of that night would stay with me forever. I would never forget the sound of the train speeding towards disaster, the feeling of being trapped, and the terror of knowing I was reliving a tragedy. I didn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty train, the locked doors, and the darkness outside the window. I avoided the train line, choosing other ways to get around the city. But even then, I couldn't escape the memories. I began researching the crash, trying to find answers. The more I read, the more I realized how close I had come to meeting the same fate as those passengers from years ago. The crash had happened exactly 10 years before, on a night just like the one I had experienced. The details were chillingly similar: an empty train, locked doors, and a terrifying speed. But there was something even more disturbing. The crash had been a mystery, with no clear cause. Some said it was a mechanical failure. Others believed it was something more supernatural, a ghost train doomed to repeat its final journey. The idea that I had been caught in a time loop was terrifying. It was the only explanation that made sense. But it also meant that the loop could catch up to me again. What if I found myself back on that train, unable to escape a second time? I tried to move on, but the nightmares continued. The memory of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of how close I had come to disaster. I knew I had been given a second chance, but I also knew that I would never truly be free of what had happened. The last ride home had changed me. I was no longer just a tired commuter. I was someone who had faced death and lived to tell the tale, but the experience had left its mark. It was a story I would carry with me for the rest of my life, a story of a train that never should have reached its destination, and a passenger who was lucky to escape with his life.